The airport was louder than I remembered. The rolling wheels of suitcases echoed against the tiled floor, a constant rhythm beneath the announcements and the hum of people moving somewhere else. I stood in line at the Sky Vista check-in counter, clutching my worn passport, the same way I used to hold on to my composure when my family mocked me. And there she was, Lauren, my sister. Hair perfectly curled, uniform sharp, her name, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, Lauren Miller, supervisor. She saw me before I said a word, her expression curling into something between surprise and amusement. "Well, look who decided to travel," she said loud enough for the two passengers behind me to hear. I gave a small smile. "Hi, Lauren." Her eyes flicked to my ticket, then to my shoes. "Economy, right, of course. Let's keep things realistic." A small laugh slipped from her lips as she turned to the young clerk beside her. "Make sure she's checked in under the lowest fare available." "Okay." The people nearby chuckled softly. I could feel the heat rise up my neck, but I said nothing. I just handed her my passport. She scanned it, smirking. "Traveling for work, Grace." "Oh, right. You don't really have a job, do you?" I inhaled through my nose, calm and slow. "Just heading somewhere," I replied. Her voice lowered, but she still made sure others could hear. "You should be grateful, you know. Not everyone can afford to fly these days." The irony was almost unbearable. I simply smiled. "You're right," I said. "I'm very grateful." She rolled her eyes. "You always were the humble one." Then she nodded to the clerk. "Economy only." The beep of the scanner filled the silence. A few seconds passed. The young clerk frowned. Ma'am," Lauren turned impatiently. "What now?" The screen flickered. Then, in bold white letters against a blue background, appeared the words, "First Class, owner of Sky Vista Airlines." The air changed instantly. Every sound seemed to fade. I heard the faint click of keyboards, the soft gasp of a passenger behind me, and the way Lauren's laughter froze mid-breath. She stared at the screen, blinking rapidly. That's not right," she muttered. "Run it again." The clerk looked terrified. "It says it twice, Miss Miller." "Owner. First class." A man in a tailored suit, someone from the upper floor by the look of him, was already striding toward us. "Miss Grace Miller?" he asked. His voice was calm, respectful. "Welcome. Security and our flight director are on their way to assist you to the private lounge." Lauren's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I turned to her slowly. "You said economy only, right?" My voice was even soft. "I think the system disagrees." Her eyes darted around as the passengers watched, whispering. The man in the suit extended his hand toward me. "Miss Miller, we're honored to have you with us today." I nodded and took my passport from my sister's trembling fingers. For a brief second, our hands touched, hers cold, mine steady. She tried to say something, but I just gave her a small, polite smile. "Now about my seat," I said quietly. The moment I stepped beyond the counter, a hush spread through the crowd. People pretended not to stare. Some didn't bother pretending. The flight attendants waiting by the lounge door bowed slightly as I passed. I caught my reflection in the glass, calm face, steady shoulders, eyes that didn't flinch anymore. As I walked toward the VIP corridor, I could still feel Lauren's stare burning into my back. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I remembered another day long ago, a dinner table laughter that wasn't meant to include me, my parents clinking their glasses while Lauren boasted about her latest promotion. "You'll get there one day," she'd said, the same way someone might tell a child she could reach the stars if she just jumped high enough. That same tone, sweet poison. I had smiled then too. That's what they never understood. I wasn't smiling because I agreed. I smiled because I was already building my escape. At the gate, a uniformed officer approached and saluted me, slightly, clearly briefed on who I was. "Miss Miller, your luggage has been upgraded and transferred to the executive section. The cabin crew will escort you personally." "Thank you," I said, my voice low, almost gentle. "Please don't make a fuss." "Yes, ma'am." Behind me, I heard the muffled commotion at the counter. Lauren's frantic voice, the man in the suit speaking quietly but firmly. I caught a few words: protocol breach, suspended, internal review. I exhaled slowly. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just release. When I reached the lounge, a steward held the door for me. The scent of coffee and polished leather filled the air. Everything gleamed. For a moment I stood there, letting the silence sink in. My heartbeat slowed, matching the rhythm of the soft jazz playing overhead. I took a seat near the window, watching planes taxi down the runway. My reflection on the glass looked unfamiliar, stronger, quieter. I thought about how many years I'd spent avoiding confrontation, thinking silence meant weakness. Now I understood it differently. Silence can be armor. It can be strategy. The door opened behind me. The same manager who'd escorted me in approached with a tablet. "Miss Miller, our CEO, sends his apologies on behalf of the company. He'd like to personally welcome you when you land." "That's unnecessary," I said. "Just make sure your employees are treated with respect, no matter their ticket." He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We'll make it right." When he left, I sat back and stared at the clouds beyond the runway. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, calm and amused. "Use it when they forget who you are." I didn't plan for it to happen this way. I hadn't come to humiliate anyone. I'd come to fly simply, quietly. But life has a strange way of handing justice to those who've waited long enough. As the plane taxied toward the runway, I thought of Lauren, of her red lipstick, her arrogance, the years of being the golden child. Maybe one day she'd understand what that moment meant. Maybe not. But I knew one thing for sure: I didn't need her apology. The system had already spoken for me. When they called for boarding, a young flight attendant approached me, clearly nervous. "Miss Miller, would you like to board first?" I shook my head. "No, let everyone else go ahead. I'll wait." She smiled with relief and gratitude, as if she expected me to demand more. But I didn't want more. I just wanted peace. When I finally stepped into the plane, the cabin was quiet, bright with morning light. My seat, 1 ampere, faced forward, crisp white linen and a glass of sparkling water waiting. I placed my bag beneath the seat, leaned back, and closed my eyes as the engines roared to life. In that soft vibration before takeoff, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: balance. Not victory, not triumph, just balance. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. The tarmac blurred as the plane began to move. People outside grew smaller, like figures from another lifetime. I thought of all the years I'd been the quiet one, the one who didn't fight back, and I realized something simple. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes all you need is the right moment and the right name flashing on the screen. I still remember the smell of lemon polish on that old dining table, the way it caught the light, just so when my parents entertained guests. It was the same table where I learned that love in my family came with conditions measured in grades, gifts, or the ability to impress a room. Lauren could do all three. I could do none. When I was 10, I painted my father a picture of a small airplane flying over the ocean. I stayed up past midnight, mixing colors until my little hands trembled. When I handed it to him that morning, my heart felt so full I thought it might burst. He smiled, politely patted my head, and set it aside. Then Lauren walked in, holding a model jet she'd bought from the store with Mom's money. "Look, Dad," she said proudly. "I built this." My father's face lit up. "That's my girl," Mom clapped. I stared at the painting lying forgotten on the sideboard, the paint still wet. That was the moment something inside me shifted. They never meant to be cruel. It was just their way, praising achievement louder than effort, noise louder than quiet. Lauren became the family's shining star, private school honors program internships, arranged through Dad's friends. I was steady, kind, dependable, the compliments people give when they can't think of anything better to say. By high school, the pattern was carved in stone. Mom pinned Lauren's awards on the living room wall, a neat line of gold and blue ribbons. Mine stayed in a drawer somewhere next to old birthday cards and half-finished sketches. At dinner, my father would look at Lauren and ask, "So what's next for you, sweetheart?" Then he'd turn to me almost as an afterthought and ask, "You're doing okay, right?" I learned early that being invisible hurt less than being mocked. By the time I turned 20, Lauren had graduated with a degree in business and was already working for SkyVista Airlines, the company Dad couldn't stop bragging about. He loved that she wore a uniform, that her job title sounded impressive. I was still in college, working part-time cleaning offices at night and serving coffee during the day. The money barely covered rent, but it gave me something more valuable: time to think. One evening, I was wiping tables at the airport cafe when I heard familiar laughter. I turned and there she was, Lauren, striding through the terminal in her crisp navy uniform, chatting with a group of pilots. She saw me, stopped, and tilted her head. Grace, her tone was half surprised, half amused. I froze, rag in hand. "Hey, Lauren." The pilots turned to look at me. She smiled, tight and polite. "Didn't know you worked here. That's sweet." Her eyes flicked to my apron, then to the trash can beside me. "Stay busy, little sis." She walked away, her heels echoing against the tile. The pilots laughed at something she said, though I didn't catch what. The sting wasn't in her words. It was in how easily she said them. Like kindness was a language she'd forgotten. When I got home that night, I didn't cry. I sat by the window of my tiny apartment and looked out at the city lights blinking like distant constellations. I promised myself one thing: I would never again beg to be seen. The only person who ever truly saw me was my grandfather, Henry Miller. He was a quiet man, gentle but sharp as glass when it came to understanding people. He used to build small model planes in his workshop and let me sit beside him while he worked. "You've got the quiet kind of mind, Grace," he'd say, "the one that listens before it moves. That's rarer than people think." When I turned 22, he called me to his house. His hands were shaky, his breath short. "I want you to have this," he said, sliding a small wooden box across the table. Inside was an old stock certificate, the paper yellowed with age. Ether Aero 10,000 shares. I looked up at him, confused. "Grandpa, is this even worth anything?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe not now, but things change. Use it when they forget who you are." A month later, he passed away. The day of the funeral, everyone cried except me. I couldn't. I stood there feeling hollow, staring at the box clutched in my hand like it was the last piece of him left. After the will was read, Mom sighed with disappointment. "He left you those old papers. That company went bankrupt years ago." Dad shrugged. Sentimental old man. Probably thought he was being poetic. Lauren smirked. "Maybe you can frame it, Grace, as a reminder to aim high." They all laughed. I smiled too, but my heart whispered, "One day you'll wish you hadn't." Within weeks, I packed my things and left home. No fight, no tears, no dramatic exit. Just silence. I rented a tiny studio on the edge of the city and took whatever jobs I could find: accounting internships, airport clerical work, odd data entry gigs. I lived cheaply, saved every dollar, and studied every night: financial markets, investment algorithms, coding languages. The world that had ignored me suddenly became my teacher. At 25, I took the old stock certificate to a brokerage office just to check its value. The clerk scanned the number, frowned, and said, "You know this company got absorbed into SkyVista Holdings about 10 years ago, right?" My heart stuttered. "SkyVista?" He nodded. "Yeah, the parent company restructured. Those shares technically converted during the merger, though most were lost or abandoned." When I left the office, the city air felt different, thinner, electric. The same family that mocked me now unknowingly worked for a company partially connected to my name. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even celebrate. I went home, poured a cup of coffee, and stared at the framed painting of that airplane I'd once given my father. The paint had faded, but the little plane still flew across the ocean, steady, unbothered. I started investing quietly, small sums at first, then larger. I learned to read the rhythm of markets the way some people read music. Every number told a story, every trend a heartbeat. I built a program on an old laptop, something simple that could track market volatility and patterns. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was mine. Years passed. My portfolio grew. I bought into companies others dismissed, watched them rise, sold before they crashed. No one knew my name, and I liked it that way. There was freedom in being underestimated. Meanwhile, Lauren's world glittered. Promotions, travel, expensive handbags flashing across her social media. Family dinners when I still attended were just stages for her latest success story. "You know, Grace," she'd say between bites of steak, "not everyone's meant for the spotlight. Some people are support staff by nature." I'd sip my water and nod. Maybe. But without the support, the spotlight falls. She'd laugh, not realizing I was no longer talking about her. When my grandfather's box resurfaced one rainy night while cleaning, I opened it again. The paper inside had grown even more fragile, but my name on it felt stronger than ever. I traced the ink of his handwriting, his blessing written in silence. I didn't know it then, but that slip of paper was more than a gift. It was a seed. From that moment, I decided to build something that couldn't be dismissed, mocked, or taken away. Something built from the quiet strength he saw in me. So I worked. I learned. I built. And I waited. Because I knew one day the same people who laughed at me for flying economy would look up and realize I had been building the sky all along. The old stock certificate looked fragile under the lamplight, the paper yellowed and curling at the edges. I spread it out on my desk, smoothing each crease carefully. Ether Arrow 10,000 shares. The ink had faded, but my grandfather's handwriting on the envelope still felt alive. "Use it when they forget who you are." I smiled faintly. They'd all forgotten a long time ago. Maybe it was time I remembered. I typed the company name into a financial database. The results came up messy, tangled through decades of acquisitions and mergers. Ether Arrow had been swallowed by a transport startup, which had been absorbed by a holding company, which had eventually merged with SkyVista Air. My pulse quickened. The same SkyVista where Lauren worked. I laughed under my breath. Not a bitter laugh, just disbelief at how life loved symmetry. At that moment, I didn't see a worthless slip of paper. I saw a possibility. The next few years became a blur of quiet obsession. I worked long hours at my logistics job, then spent nights teaching myself everything my father thought I'd never understand: finance, coding, statistics, behavioral markets. I read white papers instead of novels. My walls filled with notes and graphs written in marker. While other people dreamed about vacations, I dreamed about compound interest. My first investment wasn't glamorous. It was a small shipping company no one paid attention to. But I saw pattern contracts lining up freight costs, dropping a sudden uptick in hiring. I put in the little savings I had. 2 years later, it tripled. I didn't celebrate. I reinvested. I built a system, an algorithm, really something that analyzed emotional patterns in the market, the way I once analyzed the tone of my family's dinner conversations. I called it Move, short for Market Oscillation and Volatility Engine. It wasn't elegant, but it was precise. It listened before it moved, just like me. Around that time, I met Elliot Hughes. I was at a small investor conference far out of my league, pretending to belong. He was older, mid-60s, sharp suit, sharper eyes. He watched me scribble equations on a napkin during a break and asked, "Are you solving or creating?" I looked up, startled. "Both, I guess," he chuckled. "That's the right answer." Over coffee, he told me he'd once worked with my grandfather. Henry Miller was a visionary, he said. He didn't chase applause. He built foundations. His words landed somewhere deep inside me. When I told him about Ether Arrow and the stock certificate, he leaned back impressed. "You might be sitting on more than nostalgia." He helped me file the conversion properly, making the ownership legal under the modern corporate structure. "Most people lost these when Ether merged," he said. "But you held on." I told him I wasn't planning to sell. "Good," he said. "Build, don't cash out." Elliot became my mentor, though he never called himself that. He taught me how to move through rooms filled with men who underestimated me. The trick, he said once, is to let them keep underestimating you. It's the cheapest advantage in the world. Together we built something quiet but powerful: Ether Capital. On paper, it was a mid-size private fund. In reality, it was a web of precision and patience. We specialized in identifying undervalued aviation and logistics firms. Each investment was calculated, not emotional. Each decision surgical. Sometimes I would sit in my small apartment and scroll through the list of subsidiaries we'd acquired: shares in small carriers, maintenance companies, airport tech suppliers. And there, near the bottom of the list, was one name that made me pause: Sky Vista Holdings. I stared at it for a long time. Funny, I murmured. The company my family worships now answers to me. I didn't act immediately. I wasn't ready for confrontation. I just kept watching. Watching the numbers, watching their culture, watching the way they treated people. Meanwhile, my family stayed the same. Lauren still posted vacation photos in Bali, caption number Sky Vista Pride. Mom still sent me cheerful texts about Lauren's promotions, as if I hadn't already read the quarterly shareholder reports announcing them. Dad still spoke like his world began and ended with appearances. None of them asked what I did for a living anymore. They assumed it wasn't worth knowing. That was fine. I liked being invisible. Invisibility was leverage. When I turned 30, Elliot called me one morning, voice full of amusement. "Congratulations," he said. "You've just become the majority shareholder of Sky Vista Air." I nearly dropped my coffee. "You're kidding." "Nope," he said. "Their restructuring gave us the edge. Technically, you now own 51% through Ether Capital." I leaned back, staring at the skyline outside my window. The city looked different from up here, smaller, almost delicate. So I whispered, "My sister works for me." "Seems poetic," Elliot said. "Seems inevitable," I corrected. That night I didn't toast champagne or splurge on anything fancy. I went for a walk instead. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting. Streetlights blurred against the fog, and every sound echoed like memory. For years I had been building something no one could see. Now, it finally had weight. When I got home, I opened the wooden box again. The paper felt fragile, but the value behind it wasn't. I pressed my thumb over my grandfather's signature. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered. "You saw the pattern before anyone else did." I thought about the last thing he told me: use it when they forget who you are. They had forgotten, every single one of them. Mom once said I was the gentle one, as though it were an insult disguised as comfort. Dad used to tell me, "You're not built for leadership, Grace. You're too emotional." Lauren laughed at the idea of me running anything bigger than a spreadsheet. And yet, here I was running the company that paid her salary. There was no satisfaction in it, just a quiet steadiness, like a tide turning. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was preserving balance. Still, when I saw Sky Vista's internal employee newsletter that week, complete with a smiling photo of Lauren shaking hands with the regional manager, I couldn't help but smile. "The system always recognizes its creator," I murmured. At the end of the quarter, I reviewed the reports and sent Elliot an email schedule a performance audit for all branch management divisions. He called me that afternoon. "Sky Vista's management, including your sister's department, especially her department," I said. He paused, then laughed softly. "Grace, remind me never to underestimate you." I laughed too, but there was no malice in it. "Don't worry," I said. "I'm not looking for revenge." "I know," he said. "You're looking for accountability." Exactly. That night, I sat on my balcony, a glass of wine in hand, watching a plane climb into the dark sky. I followed its blinking lights until they disappeared among the stars. I thought of that painting I'd made as a little girl, the small airplane over the ocean. My father never looked twice at it. But maybe that was fine. I hadn't painted it for him. I'd painted it for me. Now, in a way, I'd finished it. The world below me moved on, unaware that the woman they'd dismissed, the girl who used to scrub floors at the airport, now owned the skies above them. I didn't need to announce it. The truth would reveal itself when the time was right. and when it did, I would be ready. The restaurant was already half full when I arrived. Candles flickered on the tables, glasses chimed, and laughter floated between bites of expensive steak. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching my family from a distance. They hadn't noticed me yet. Lauren sat at the head of the table, perfectly centered under the chandelier, her laugh a little too loud, her confidence a little too rehearsed. Mom and Dad flanked her on either side like loyal supporters. Diana, our middle sister, was scrolling on her phone, pretending to listen. I walked over holding a small bouquet of lilies. "Hi," I said softly. They all looked up. Mom smiled with that polite warmth she saved for awkward situations. "Grace, there you are. We were just talking about you." "Really?" I asked, setting the flowers on the table. Lauren smirked. "We were wondering if you'd gotten lost again. You were always the late one." "I'm right on time," I said, sliding into the empty chair at the end of the table. Dad waved for the waiter. "Let's order before it gets crowded." "Lauren, you're leading right." Lauren nodded proudly. "Sky Vista just promoted me to regional supervisor. I'll be overseeing the entire check-in department across Atlanta," Mom gasped. "Oh, sweetheart, that's incredible. We're so proud of you." Dad lifted his glass. "To Lauren, the pride of this family." Glasses clinked except mine. I took a quiet sip of water instead. Mom turned to me. "And you, Grace? What have you been up to?" I smiled faintly. "Working, reading, investing some time into new projects." Lauren arched an eyebrow. "Projects? That sounds mysterious." "You finally joined one of those online money-making things," Diana snickered. "Careful, Grace. That's how people get scammed." I leaned back in my chair unfazed. "Don't worry, I'm pretty good with numbers." Lauren tilted her head. "You were always good at math. Just not at using it." The table laughed, even Dad. I just smiled, steady and silent. When the waiter arrived with wine, Lauren took over again, ordering for everyone as if she were the host. She liked control, always had. It made her feel powerful, like she could choreograph the whole world into submission. Between courses, Mom reached across the table to pat my hand. "You know, honey, not everyone needs to climb so high. You've always been our peaceful one." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a condolence. Lauren leaned forward, swirling her wine. "Speaking of climbing, we're all planning a trip later this year. Maybe a little family vacation to Italy. Of course, first class. I don't think economy seats could survive Dad's knees." Mom laughed. "Oh, that sounds wonderful." Lauren smirked, eyes flicking toward me. "But I guess we'd have to make sure everyone could afford it. I mean, it'd be awkward if someone got stuck in the back." Diana covered her laugh with her napkin. I stared at her for a long second, then smiled. "Don't worry, I'll manage my ticket." Lauren's grin widened. "That's the spirit, sis. Keep things realistic." The waiter returned with entrees. Conversation drifted to lighter things: wedding plans for Diana's friend, Dad's golf games, Mom's charity committee. I kept mostly quiet, letting their voices wash over me like white noise. Years ago, that silence would have felt like exclusion. Now it just felt like distance. When dessert came, Lauren reached for her phone and turned the screen toward us. "Oh look, Sky Vista posted my promotion photo. I'm officially the youngest supervisor in the division." Dad beamed. "That's my girl, making a name for herself." Lauren looked at me. "And you still doing freelance stuff, something like that?" I said. Her smile sharpened. "You should come see my office sometime. Maybe I'll get you a visitor's pass. Just don't wander near the executive floor." I met her gaze, calm and unblinking. "You'd be surprised where I have access." She blinked, thrown off by my tone. "Excuse me, nothing," I said. "Just talking about security levels." She frowned but let it go, turning back to Dad. The meal ended with polite hugs and smiles, but the air between us was thicker than smoke. As we stepped out into the parking lot, the night air hit cold against my skin. I walked toward my car, but Lauren's heels clicked fast behind me. "Hey," she called. "Don't walk off like that." I turned. "Like what? Like you're above all this," she said, crossing her arms. You think that blank expression makes you mysterious. It just makes you look smug. I looked at her, really looked at her. The expensive coat, the perfect hair, the insecurity barely hidden beneath her posture. I'm not smug, Lauren, I'm just tired. Tired of what she snapped. Being normal, tired of pretending respect and love are the same thing. Her eyes flashed. You always take things so personally. It's just teasing. Teasing is supposed to be funny, I said. It only is when both people laugh. She rolled her eyes. You really need to lighten up. You're still so sensitive. No wonder you've never made it far. The world doesn't hand out awards for quiet people. I smiled slightly. Good thing I stopped asking for them. Lauren scoffed. You know I actually try to include you. I invite you to dinners, update you about the family. And you show up acting like you're doing us a favor. Maybe I am, I said softly. She laughed. Wow. You really think you're something, don't you? I took a step closer, lowering my voice. You mistake kindness for weakness, Lauren. Don't do that again. Her jaw tightened. Or what? I shrugged. Or one day you'll find out who you've been talking to. She frowned, confused. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said, turning toward my car. Just be careful who you look down on. The floor shifts fast. I drove home in silence, the city lights flashing across my windshield like passing thoughts. My heart wasn't racing, and I didn't feel angry, just clear. That dinner had been the final confirmation of something I'd known for years. They weren't going to change. But I had. When I got home, I set my phone on the counter. Messages were already coming in. Mom thanking me for coming. Dad sending a link to an article about Lauren's promotion. And then Lauren's post popped up on social media, dinner with the fam. So proud of my new title. Some people just keep reaching higher. I stared at the screen, the photo of her beaming her arm around our parents, me blurred in the background. I opened my laptop. The glow of the screen filled the room with cold light. I typed my password, logged into the encrypted system of Ether Capital, and scrolled through the list of holdings. My cursor hovered over one line, Sky Vista Air Holdings, 61% ownership. I exhaled slowly, my reflection ghostly against the screen. She thinks she runs the skies, I whispered. She doesn't know she works for me. The clock read past midnight, but I didn't feel tired. I clicked to review the upcoming audit schedule. A memo from Elliot sat at the top of my inbox. Performance reviews start next week. Any particular divisions you'd like us to monitor? I typed one word back, Atlanta. Then I closed the laptop and stood by the window. Outside, the city slept under a dull silver moon. I watched a plane rise into the skylights, blinking against the darkness. Economy, first class, it didn't matter. Up there, everyone looked the same size. I smiled faintly. Economy will do, I murmured. Because the next time Lauren saw me, she wouldn't be laughing, and the system would finally remember who I was. The airport was buzzing that morning, full of chatter, rolling luggage, and coffee cups clinking against tabletops. I moved through the crowd with calm precision, like someone who knew exactly where she was going. My ticket, economy as planned, sat neatly folded inside my passport. I'd chosen Sky Vista Air for this flight on purpose. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I reached the check-in line, I spotted her almost instantly. Lauren stood behind the counter, her uniform crisp, her hair pulled into that perfect bun that probably took half a can of hairspray. She was talking to another agent, gesturing dramatically, as if directing a stage play. When her eyes landed on me, her smirk appeared like clockwork. Well, well, she said loudly, stepping forward. If it isn't my little sister. Didn't expect to see you flying today. I smiled politely. Morning, Lauren. She looked at my shoes, my plain carry-on bag, and the paper ticket in my hand. Let me guess, she said, voice dripping with mock pity. Economy, right. Economy's fine, I replied evenly. Lauren turned to her co-worker. Make sure she's in the lowest fare bracket. No need for upgrades, she's simple like that. A few passengers nearby chuckled softly. I could feel their glances, sympathetic, curious, maybe even a little entertained. I'd been here before, just not in this setting. Same humiliation, different stage. Lauren leaned closer. You could have called me, you know. I could have gotten you a staff discount. That's generous, I said, handing her my passport, but I wouldn't want to make you work harder than usual. She scanned the document, still smirking. You'll have to excuse me if I double-check your balance. We get so many surprises these days. Her voice carried across the counter, designed to humiliate. I kept my expression calm. Of course. The line behind me had gone quiet, the air tense with unspoken discomfort. Even her coworker seemed uneasy. Lauren's laughter broke the silence. Oh, come on, Grace. Don't look so serious. I'm just teasing. You know I love you. Of course you do, I said softly. You just have a strange way of showing it. She rolled her eyes. Lighten up. Not everything's a big deal. For her, it never was. She tapped a few keys on the keyboard, frowning when the system didn't respond immediately. That's weird, she muttered. Must be the new update. The screen froze, then flashed. Her coworker leaned over to help. Another few seconds passed, and then clear as day bold text appeared across the monitor: First Class, owner of Skyvista Airlines. The beeping stopped. So did the noise around us. Lauren blinked. What is this? She tapped the screen again. There must be a mistake. The young clerk looked pale. No, ma'am. It's verified through the internal system. Her eyes darted from the monitor to my face. Owner, I met her gaze calmly. That's what it says. For the first time in her life, my sister was speechless. A man in a tailored suit appeared from the back office, his ID badge reading Regional Director. He hurried forward, extending a hand toward me. Miss Grace Miller, my apologies for the delay. Please allow me to escort you personally. Your lounge access and priority boarding are ready. Lauren turned to him, still frozen. Wait, you're saying? He interrupted gently. Miss Miller is the principal shareholder of our parent company. Her approval is on every quarterly report. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The director's tone shifted to business. Please, Miss Miller, come with me. We'll make sure everything is handled smoothly. As he spoke, I took my passport back from Lauren's trembling hand. For a moment, I thought she might drop it. Thank you, I said quietly. She stared at me like I was someone else entirely. Maybe I was. The passengers behind me whispered. Someone muttered, Wait, she owns the airline. Another voice replied, Guess Karma flies first class too. The director gestured politely toward the security area. We've arranged a private escort to the lounge. Lauren finally found her voice. This can't be right. There must be an error. I turned to her, my expression soft, almost sympathetic. No error, Lauren. Just oversight. The look on her face was one I'd seen before, back when we were kids and I beat her once at chess. Disbelief, then panic, then shame. Only now, it wasn't a game. Have a good day, I said simply, and followed the director. The crowd parted without a word. People stared, but didn't speak. Some smiled faintly, as if watching justice unfold in real time. The hum of the airport returned, slower, now quieter. In the VIP lounge, everything smelled of coffee and calm. The chairs were leather, the light warm and golden. A stewardess approached. Can I get you anything, miss? Miller. Just tea, thank you, I said, settling into a chair near the window. Through the glass, I could still see the check-in counter in the distance. Lauren stood there, shoulders stiff, head bent, as the director spoke to her. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. I knew that tone controlled corporate final. The tea arrived, steaming in a porcelain cup. I wrapped my hands around it and let the warmth seep into my palms. For a long time, I just watched planes take off, silver streaks vanishing into the morning sky. I thought of all the years I'd spent grounded by other people's opinions, their labels, their small definitions of who I was supposed to be. I thought of my grandfather, and that old line of his echoing again in my mind. Use it when they forget who you are. They had forgotten, and now they remembered. After a while, I stood and walked to the lounge reception. Please let the gate staff know I'll board last, I said. The attendant looked surprised. Last? But you have priority boarding, I smiled. I know. When I finally approached the gate, the same young clerk who'd checked me in earlier stood there nervously. Miss Miller, we're so sorry for the misunderstanding. No need to apologize, I said gently. Just treat people kindly next time. You never know who's standing in front of you. She nodded, visibly moved. As I stepped onto the jet bridge, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned slightly. Lauren stood a few yards away, pale eyes red. She didn't speak, just stared, her lips parting like she wanted to say something but couldn't. For a fleeting second, I saw not the arrogant supervisor, but the sister I used to share a bedroom with, the one who told me ghost stories under a blanket fort. I gave her a small, almost invisible nod, then boarded the plane. Inside the cabin was quiet. My seat 1 ampere was waiting, gleaming white leather, a folded blanket, and a small card embossed with my initials. I sat down, placed my bag neatly under the seat, and exhaled. The engines hummed to life. I looked out the window, watching the ground crew move like ants below. The plane began to roll smooth and steady. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel small. I didn't even feel triumphant. I just felt balanced. The loudspeaker crackled overhead. Welcome aboard, Miss Miller. We're honored to have you with us. I smiled, more to myself than to anyone else. They called me economy. The system called me owner. I called it justice. The morning after the flight, I woke up to the vibration of my phone. At first I thought it was an alarm, but the sound didn't stop. It was message after message, notifications lighting up the screen like a fire. I rubbed my eyes and opened one, then another, and another. Every single one of them was about me. Grace, you're trending. That was the first text from Elliot. A link followed. Airport supervisor publicly humiliates passenger, turns out she works for the passenger. I clicked it. The headline stared back at me, bold and merciless. Below it, a video clip already had over 2 million views. Someone had recorded the entire scene, Lauren's mocking tone, the crowd's awkward laughter, the screen flashing owner of SkyVista Airlines. The comments section was a battlefield of opinions, instant karma. She handled that with class. That smile at the end, iconic. I put the phone down and stared out the hotel window. The city shimmered in morning light, but all I felt was stillness. I wasn't angry, I wasn't even proud, it just was. The doorbell rang. Room service. The server wheeled in a tray of coffee, eggs, and fruit. Compliments of SkyVista Air, Miss Miller, he said with a nervous smile. I thanked him and tipped extra. When he left, I sat by the window with my coffee, scrolling through the flood of headlines. The calmest revenge you'll ever see. Grace Miller becomes symbol of silent power. Number economy tuner, trend inspires, stories worldwide. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had never wanted fame. All I'd ever wanted was respect. Now the whole world was giving it to me, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exposure. By noon, my inbox was overflowing. Invitations for interviews, partnership requests, TV producers wanting to share my empowering story. I declined them all. I wasn't interested in becoming anyone's entertainment. Then the call came from Elliot. Grace, he said, half amused, half wary. You broke the internet. I didn't do anything, I said. That's the point, he replied. You didn't need to. Silence travels faster than sound. I could hear him typing in the background. The board already reached out. They're panicking about optics. SkyVista's public relations team is begging for a statement. I don't have one, I said, sipping my coffee. Let them do what they need to. You know this means your sister's going to take the fall, right? I looked out the window. She made her choices. The silence on the line carried weight. You're handling this better than I would. I've been rehearsing for it my whole life, I said. That afternoon, the official statement came out. SkyVista Air regrets the unprofessional conduct of one employee. We extend our deepest apologies to Miss Grace Miller, our principal shareholder. The world already knew the rest. By evening, I couldn't avoid it anymore. Mom's number flashed on my phone, followed by a dozen missed calls from Dad. I ignored them until one message came through that made me pause. "Mom, your sister's been suspended. She's devastated. Please fix this before it destroys our family." Fix this. The words made me laugh out loud. They never called when I was being humiliated. They never called when Lauren publicly mocked me at dinners. But now that her power was gone now, it was a family emergency. I put the phone face down and poured another cup of coffee. Around 6, I turned on the news. Lauren's photo filled the screen, her corporate headshot, all smiles and confidence. Below it, Sky Vista supervisor under review following viral video. The reporter's voice was measured, sympathetic. Sources confirm the employee has been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation. Miss Miller has reportedly refused to comment. I stared at her image on the screen. My sister looked smaller now, the light in her eyes gone. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel pity either, just distance. A knock on the door broke my thoughts. When I opened it, Lauren stood there. She looked different, hair pulled back messily. No makeup, eyes red from crying. "Grace," she said, voice trembling. I stepped aside silently. She walked in clutching a crumpled tissue. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. "Sit," I said. She sat on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands. "They fired me. Well, suspended me. Same thing. Everyone saw the video. I can't even check my email. Reporters are calling my friends." Her words spilled out fast, desperate. "I'm sorry you're going through that," I said evenly. Her eyes snapped up. "Sorry, Grace. You could fix this. You own them. Just call the board. Tell them it was a misunderstanding." I met her gaze. "Was it?" She flinched. "I didn't mean to humiliate you. It was just habit," I asked. "Like breathing." Lauren's face crumpled. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Seeing me fall?" "No," I said softly. "I stopped enjoying other people's pain a long time ago." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Please, Grace. Mom's losing sleep. Dad's furious. They're saying you're destroying the family's reputation." "I tilted me hill. Funny. When you were laughing at me in front of strangers, I don't recall anyone worrying about reputation." Her lower lip trembled. "I made a mistake." I stood up, walking to the window. The sunset painted the sky gold and pink, the city glowing beneath it. "Lauren, you didn't make one mistake. You made 1,000 small ones and wrapped them in arrogance." She started crying quietly. "You don't understand. I spent my whole life trying to make them proud. Every title, every raise, it was the only way they looked at me." "I understand perfectly," I said. "I just stopped playing the game." She didn't move for a long time. Then she whispered, "So, that's it. You're not going to help me." I turned around. "I'm not going to punish you either." Her brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means the world already did what I couldn't." She stood shakily, grabbing her bag. "You'll regret this, Grace. You'll regret being cruel." I smiled faintly. "Maybe. But for once, I'm not the one who should." When she left, the room felt heavier and lighter at the same time. I poured myself another cup of tea and let the silence stretch. Later that night, Elliot called again. "They're offering to make you an executive advisor for the ethics committee," he said. "Damage control mostly." I laughed softly. "Irony's got a sense of humor," he chuckled. "You going to accept? I'll think about it." When the call ended, I opened the curtains. The city lights shimmered, airplanes cutting streaks of silver across the sky. Somewhere out there, another flight was taking off, someone boarding, someone leaving, someone returning. I thought about Lauren, about the child version of her who used to hold my hand crossing the street. I thought about how power changes people, how it changes everything. And then I thought about something my grandfather once said while carving a small wooden plane for me. "The sky's big enough for everyone, Grace. But some people forget that and try to own it." Maybe now Lauren would remember. I sat back down the phone, silent again. For the first time in years, there were no voices telling me who to be, what to fix, or how to act. Only quiet. And in that quiet, I realized the storm was over. Not because I'd won, but because I no longer needed to fight. The call came 2 days later. I had just finished reviewing quarterly reports when Mom's name lit up my phone. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, but something in me maybe made me answer. "Grace," she said, her voice shaking. "We're having dinner tonight. At the house. The family needs to talk." I hesitated. "About what?" Her sigh trembled. "You know what about. Please, come." The line went dead before I could reply. That evening I drove to the old Miller house. The closer I got, the tighter my chest felt. The white porch light still flickered the way it always had, like the house itself was nervous. Through the window I could see shadows moving: Lauren's hunched shoulders, Dad's stiff posture, Mom pacing. And another figure I hadn't seen in months, Diana. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with something sour, guilt maybe, or fear. Mom smiled too quickly. "Grace, you came. Thank you." Lauren didn't look up. She sat at the dining table, her hands clenched around a napkin. Dad was at the head of the table, his expression grim. Diana gave me a practiced smile, the kind that didn't touch her eyes. I took a seat across from them. "So," I said quietly, "what's this about?" Dad's voice cut through the silence. "Enough games, Grace. You've embarrassed this family enough." I leaned back, embarrassed I didn't record that video, Dad. He slammed his hand against the table, the sound sharp. "That's not the point. The point is, you let it spread. You let your sister get dragged through the mud." Lauren's eyes flashed with tears. "I'm being followed, Grace. People recognize me in grocery stores, they whisper. I can't get another job." Mom reached across the table, grabbing my hand. "Sweetheart, please, fix this before it ruins us completely." I looked at her hand, soft, trembling, the same hand that once smoothed my hair after nightmares. "You all only call me sweetheart when you want something," I said. Mom's face fell. "That's not fair." "No," I said, "it's finally fair." Diana cleared her throat. "Look, everyone made mistakes. But airing dirty laundry in public? That's not how families handle things." "Families," I repeated, smiling faintly. "That's what we're calling this now." Lauren wiped her face. "You think you're better than us because you have money, because you finally won." "This was never about winning," I said. "It was about respect." Dad scoffed. "Respect? You humiliated your own blood." I looked him dead in the eye. "Did you ever stop her from humiliating me?" The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Mom started to cry quietly. "We just want peace, Grace. We want things to go back to how they were." I shook my head. "Back to how they were means me being silent while you all talk over me. It means being small so you can stay comfortable. That's not peace. That's obedience." Diana tried to soften her voice. "What if you made a public statement? Something that says it was a misunderstanding. People would move on." Dad nodded. "It's time to be mature about this." I laughed, quiet, sharp, short. "You taught me that maturity means pretending things don't hurt. I'm done pretending." Lauren's voice cracked. "I already lost everything." "Isn't that enough for you?" I looked at her. Really looked. Her face pale. Her mascara smudged, the sparkle gone from her eyes. "You didn't lose everything, Lauren. You just lost the illusion that you could treat people however you wanted, without consequence." She opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came. The room went still. Then softly I said, "When I was cleaning floors to pay for college, none of you called to ask if I was okay. When Lauren laughed at me for wearing thrift store clothes, you all laughed too. And now that I finally stood up for myself, suddenly I'm cruel." Dad rubbed his temple. "We did what we thought was best." "No," I said. "You did what was convenient." I stood up. "You didn't raise a family, Dad. You raised a hierarchy." He froze, hand mid-air, unable to respond. Mom covered her face, shoulders trembling. And then my phone buzzed. I glanced down, an email notification from Elliot. Subject: Audit Update. Henry Miller Foundation. Something cold crept down my spine. I opened it right there at the table. Numbers filled the screen. Wire transfers, shell companies, repeated withdrawals. The recipient name hit me like a punch. Diana Consulting LLC. I looked up slowly. Diana, I said, my voice quiet but sharp. You've been stealing from the foundation. Her eyes went wide. What? No, what are you talking about? I turned the screen toward her. 2 years of fake invoices, funds redirected to your personal account. Signed by Dad as approval. Mom's breath caught. Thomas' dad turned red. That's not what it looks like. It looks exactly like theft, I said. Lauren whispered. Oh my God. Diana's voice broke. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I just needed money to cover debts. Dad said he'd fix it. Mom's tears turned to anger. You used your grandfather's name to steal. Diana started crying. I was going to pay it back. Dad slammed his fist again. Enough. We'll handle this privately. I stared at him. Privately. Just like every other sin in this family. Sweep it under the rug until someone else steps in it. His eyes hardened. Don't you dare lecture me. Then stop giving me reasons to, I said. No one spoke after that. The house was so silent I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. I took a slow breath. Do you know what's sad, Dad? I would have helped you. Any of you, if you'd just asked. Mom looked at me, eyes hollow. What are you going to do? I'm going to do what you never did, I said. Tell the truth. I walked to the door but paused before leaving. Lauren called out softly, Grace, please, don't ruin us. I turned back. I'm not ruining you. I'm revealing you. Outside the air smelled like rain. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the thunder roll somewhere in the distance. Through the window I could see them, Lauren sobbing into her hands, Diana pleading, Mom, frozen, Dad glaring. The empire of denial collapsing in real time. I stepped off the porch and into the drizzle. It felt cool, almost cleansing. My hair stuck to my face, but I didn't care. By the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed again. Elliot's message, need your approval to proceed with the audit. Everything's ready for submission. I typed one word back, approved. As I drove away, the rain grew heavier. The windshield blurred the road into streaks of gray and gold from the streetlights. I thought about how strange justice looked, how quiet it could be, how heavy it could feel. They'd called me cruel. Maybe I was. But cruelty built on truth isn't cruelty at all. It's clarity. I wiped the fog from the window and whispered to no one. You can't fix what was never whole. Then I pressed the gas and kept driving, leaving the house and everything it stood for behind me. The night after the dinner, I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of thunder. I sat by the window, laptop open, staring at the email from Elliot. The audit report for the Henry Miller Foundation was ready, every line item, every fraudulent transfer, every signature that wasn't supposed to exist. My name sat at the top of the document, authorization pending. I read it once. Then again. Each page felt like peeling back the skin of a lie I'd been living in for years. The first few transactions looked small, 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Then it grew, 100,000, 200,000, a pattern of greed disguised as consulting fees. At the bottom of each authorization line, a familiar signature curved in blue ink, Thomas Miller. My father hadn't just looked the other way, he'd signed off. I pushed the laptop away and stood. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, distorted by the faint condensation. So it wasn't just Diana, I thought. It was all of them. When I finally called Elliot, my voice was steady. I want the report filed first thing tomorrow. He paused. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Once it's in the system, it becomes federal. There's no taking it back. I looked out at the skyline, the quiet hum of traffic below. I'm sure, he sighed softly. All right, Grace, I'll submit it at 8. Send me a copy, I said. After the call, I walked to the old wooden box on my bookshelf, the one that used to hold my grandfather's stock certificate. Inside, folded neatly beside the faded document, was his note. The paper had softened with age, but the ink still held strong. Use it when they forget who you are. I traced the words with my thumb. They forgot, I whispered. But I didn't. The next morning I woke to a stream of messages again, this time not from the internet but from my family. Mom, what did you do, Grace? The foundation's lawyers just called. Dad, we need to talk. Don't make this worse. Diana, you'll destroy us all if you send that report. Please, I can fix it. I ignored them. Elliot confirmed at 8:07 a.m. Audit report officially submitted to the Federal Financial Board. The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a storm. By noon, I was sitting in the office at Ether Capital reviewing market data when the phone on my desk rang. My assistant's voice came through. There's a Miss Diana Miller here to see you. Should I send her up? I hesitated. Yes. A few minutes later, she walked in designer coat, perfectly blow-dried hair, but her eyes were frantic, glassy. She didn't bother with pleasantries. How could you do this? She said, slamming her hands on my desk. You filed the report, yes. Her voice cracked. Grace, that's our family's name, our grandfather's legacy. You're going to turn us into criminals, I leaned back calm. I didn't turn you into anything, Diana. You did that yourself. She pointed a shaking finger at me. You think you're righteous, but you're just like Dad, cold, calculating, heartless. No, I said quietly. I'm becoming what he should have been. Her lip trembled. You're really going to let them destroy him? Our father, I tilted my head. He destroyed himself when he signed those transfers. She sank into the chair opposite me, burying her face in her hands. It wasn't supposed to be this big. I just borrowed some of the funds for a business deal. Dad said he'd cover it before the audit. I studied her for a moment. You stole from the foundation built in our grandfather's name and used Dad to hide it. Tell me, Diana, when did you start calling theft a business deal? She looked up, tears streaking her makeup. You don't understand. I was drowning, Grace. The debts, the pressure, it felt like there was no way out. You could have asked me. Her eyes widened, full of disbelief. You would have helped. Yes, I said simply. But you never saw me as someone capable of helping. You saw me as someone small enough to step over. Her shoulders sagged. Please, retract the report. I'm begging you. I'll pay it back. I shook my head. It's not about the money anymore. It's about what our name means. Her breath hitched. You sound just like him, maybe, I said. But the difference is I'm not lying about it. She stood abruptly. If this goes public, Mom will have a breakdown. Lauren's already ruined. Do you really want to be the last one standing? I didn't answer. Fine, she spat, grabbing her purse. Enjoy your throne, Grace. But don't pretend you're clean. When the doors slammed behind her, the office fell silent again. By late afternoon, news had started to spread quietly through the finance circles. The foundation was under federal review. Anonymous leaks hinted at internal misconduct among key trustees. I knew it was only a matter of time before the family's names became public. Mom called again. I let it go to voicemail, but her voice played automatically. Grace, please. Whatever you're doing, stop. You'll ruin us. You'll ruin your father. I set the phone down gently and looked out at the skyline again. The sunset bled into the horizon, turning the clouds crimson. When Elliot called that evening, I already knew what he was going to say. The press got wind of it, he said. They'll publish by morning. You should prepare yourself. I am prepared, I said. You don't sound angry. I'm not, I said. I'm just done. He was quiet for a moment. Grace, he said softly, this might make them hate you. I smiled faintly. They already did. This just makes it official. That night I went for a walk downtown. The air was cold and smelled faintly of smoke from food carts closing for the night. I passed a newsstand. The early editions already stacked headlines whispering of scandal. Miller Foundation, under federal investigation. Family legacy tarnished by internal corruption. My family's name in black ink. A man buying a paper beside me muttered, "Can't trust anyone rich anymore." I almost laughed. He had no idea who was standing next to him. When I got home, I poured a glass of wine and opened my email again. Messages from lawyers, journalists, financial regulators, dozens of them. But one stood out short, and to the point from Elliot, "You did the right thing." I closed the laptop and sat there, the city glowing outside my window. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace, not the kind that comes from forgiveness, but from finality. Before bed, I pulled the old wooden box from the shelf one more time. Inside, I placed the printed audit report beside my grandfather's note. His handwriting looked steadier than I felt, but his words anchored me. "Use it when they forget who you are." They forgot, I whispered again, this time smiling. "And now they'll remember." When I turned off the lights, the room went dark except for the faint glow of the skyline. Somewhere, sirens wailed in the distance, fading as they moved away. The storm had started, and this time I wasn't afraid of the thunder. The boardroom was made of glass walls, table, even the door. Everything in it gleamed, reflecting the cold morning light. You could see the whole city from up there, but all I saw were faces I'd known my entire life. My father sat at the end of the table, his jaw clenched, a gray suit that looked too stiff for comfort. Lauren sat to his right, pale and nervous, avoiding my eyes. Diana, to his left, stared down at her hands. Across from them sat the CEO of Sky Vista, and several board members, their expressions carefully neutral. At the far side of the room, Elliot stood with a folder in hand, watching quietly. I took my seat at the head of the table. No one said a word. The CEO cleared his throat first. "Miss Miller, thank you for meeting on such short notice. Given recent events involving the foundation and the public attention toward your family, we thought it necessary to clarify the company's position." I nodded slowly. "Of course. Let's start with the facts." I tapped the folder in front of me and opened it. The first slide appeared on the screen behind me. Henry Miller Foundation Audit Report Summary. Diana's head snapped up. Lauren whispered, "Grace, don't." But I continued. "The audit has revealed a pattern of unauthorized transfers from the foundation's accounts totaling nearly $800,000. These transactions were signed off by my father, Thomas Miller, under the pretense of strategic investments." My father's face turned red. "That's enough." "No," I said, looking straight at him. "For years we let lies masquerade as loyalty. That ends today." Elliot handed out copies of the report. The sound of paper shuffling filled the silence. One of the board members, a woman named Clara, frowned as she flipped through the pages. "These are official transfers." "Did the family not realize this violated federal charitable laws?" Diana's voice trembled. "It wasn't like that. It was supposed to be temporary." My father slammed his hand on the table. "Stop talking, Diana." "Why?" I said. "Let her finish. For once, let her speak her own truth." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I just wanted to make it right, Grace. Dad said he'd help me fix it before anyone noticed." My father's jaw tightened. "You're not throwing me under the bus to save yourself," Lauren whispered. "This is insane." I turned toward her. "What's insane is pretending none of this happened." The CEO leaned forward, his tone cautious. "Miss Miller, while this is a family matter, Sky Vista's image is intertwined with the foundation's. The press is asking whether internal ethics apply to everyone, including the family of our majority shareholder." I stood. "That's exactly why we're here." I clicked to the next slide, charts of transfers, statements, signatures. Everything laid bare. For the record, I said clearly, Sky Vista had no involvement in these actions. The responsibility lies solely within the Miller family. Lauren flinched. "Grace, stop making this public. You're destroying us." I looked at her, my voice steady. "I'm not destroying you, Lauren. I'm dismantling a lie." The CEO nodded toward me, signaling for me to continue. I turned my gaze back to my father. "You taught me that appearances were everything, that a family's reputation mattered more than its integrity. You were wrong," he sneered. "You think exposing us makes you noble. You're just bitter." "Bitter," I repeated. "Maybe once, not anymore. This isn't revenge, Dad. It's a reckoning." The room went silent. Outside, the faint hum of engines filled the air as a plane took off from the runway below. My father straightened, his voice rising. Everything I did was for this family. You think you're the only one who's sacrificed? No, I said softly. I think I'm the only one who stopped pretending the sacrifice was pure. Lauren buried her face in her hands. Please, Grace, enough. You've already taken everything from me. I turned toward her. No, Lauren. I didn't take anything. The truth did. The CEO cleared his throat again. Miss Miller, what do you propose as next steps? Restitution, I said simply. The stolen funds will be returned to the foundation immediately. The board will issue a public statement confirming the corrective actions taken. Elliot stepped forward. We've already arranged a legal framework to ensure compliance. My father barked. You're not pressing charges. I'm not, I said. But the law might. He leaned forward, voice cold. You'll regret this, Grace. You think you're the hero here. You're just a traitor wearing a crown. I met his glare. If the truth feels like betrayal, maybe the problem isn't the truth. Clara, the board member, broke the silence. I've worked with the Millers for 20 years. Henry would have been proud of this moment, Miss Grace. The words hit harder than I expected. I took a slow breath. Thank you. The CEO stood. In light of today's disclosures, we'll be initiating an internal ethics committee. Miss Miller, would you be willing to chair it? I nodded. Yes, my father scoffed. Of course, she'll sit in judgment over the rest of us. I turned to him one last time. I'm not judging you, Dad. I'm freeing myself from you. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he pushed back his chair and stormed out the door, slamming behind him so hard the glass rattled. Diana sobbed quietly. Lauren sat frozen. The CEO looked at me with a mixture of discomfort and admiration. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Miller, he said. It's rare in rooms like these. When the meeting adjourned, I gathered my papers and walked to the window. The city stretched endlessly below, alive and distant. I saw a plane rise into the clouds, tiny, silver, unstoppable. Lauren's reflection appeared beside mine in the glass. You really don't feel anything? She asked quietly. I turned to her. Of course I do. I feel free. She looked down, tears welling up again. I hate you. I know, I said gently, but someday you'll understand. She walked out, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Elliot joined me by the window, setting a hand on my shoulder. It's over, he said. Not yet, I murmured. But it's ending. He nodded toward the departing plane. You won't be flying alone anymore, Grace. You've built your own sky. I smiled faintly. Maybe. But I'm still learning how to breathe in it. When everyone had gone, I lingered for a moment longer. The sunlight hit the table just right, making the documents glow like a confession finally spoken aloud. For years I'd been fighting ghosts, my family's expectations, their cruelty, my own silence. Now the ghosts were gone, replaced by something far heavier but truer peace. As I walked out of the glass room, I didn't look back. The echo of my heels on the marble floor sounded like closure, sharp, steady, final. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed. A text from Elliot. The press is waiting outside. Want me to handle them? I typed back, no. Let them see me. The doors closed and I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, composed, still unshakable. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small under the weight of my name. I was the name, and no one could take that from me again. The airport was quiet that morning, almost unnaturally so. The kind of quiet that follows a storm when the world seems to exhale and reset itself. I wheeled my small carry-on toward the private terminal, nodding politely to the staff who greeted me by name. They looked nervous, as if I might snap my fingers and change their fates. I didn't blame them. The last few weeks had made my name sound heavier than I wanted it to. At the counter, a young woman in a navy blazer smiled shyly. Good morning, Miss Miller. Your jet is ready when you are. Would you like us to prepare the lounge? No need, I said softly. I won't be long. She nodded and handed back my passport. Safe travels, ma'am. The sound of my heels echoed down the corridor as I walked toward the tarmac. The air smelled like fuel and wind. A sleek silver plane waited at the end of the path, gleaming under the sunrise. The words Skyvista Executive stretched across its side in neat navy letters. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I climbed the stairs, the breeze caught my hair, brushing it against my cheek. For a moment, I thought of the first time I'd walked through this same airport, head down, cheap shoes, humiliation burning in my chest. Now, years later, I wasn't angry anymore, just grateful that pain could build something strong. Inside the cabin was quiet, lined with pale leather and polished wood. I took my seat by the window and watched the ground crew move below. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, calm, composed, older somehow. "Welcome aboard, Miss Miller," the captain said from the doorway. "We'll depart for Atlanta in 15 minutes. "Thank you," I replied. "Take your time." When he left, I exhaled and leaned back, letting the hum of the engines vibrate softly beneath my feet. I opened my laptop to check the morning headlines. The Miller family scandal. A daughter's quiet reckoning. Grace Miller restores integrity to Skyvista legacy. My face was there, of course. The picture they'd chosen was one from the board meeting, me standing in front of the glass wall, hands folded, eyes steady. To the world, I was a symbol now, calm, composed, controlled, but inside all I felt was tired. I closed the laptop and turned my gaze toward the sky. Planes crossed in the distance, white trails cutting through the blue. I wondered how many people on those flights were running from failure, from family, from themselves. The attendant brought me tea in a white porcelain cup. "Would you like sugar, ma'am?" "No," I said, smiling. "Just quiet." As I sipped, my thoughts drifted to Lauren. After the board meeting, she hadn't called. I hadn't expected her to. The last time I saw her, she'd walked out of the glass room, eyes full of something I couldn't name. Anger, shame, maybe both. And yet I couldn't hate her. Not anymore. I understood her too well. She'd spent her whole life trying to be adored, while I'd spent mine trying to be invisible. Both of us were wrong in our own ways. I thought of Diana too, of her trembling hands, when I'd confronted her in my office, of the desperate way she said, "You'll destroy us." I hadn't destroyed them, the truth had. All I'd done was stop protecting the lie. The engines roared to life. The plane began to move. I looked out the window as the runway blurred beneath us, and the moment the wheels lifted, something inside me loosened, like gravity had been holding my heart hostage for years, and finally let go. As we climbed through the clouds, the world below shrank into patches of gray and green. The horizon glowed gold. I remembered something my grandfather used to say: altitude changes perspective, not truth. Back then, I didn't understand it. Now I did. The higher you go, the smaller the noise becomes. I reached into my bag and pulled out his wooden box. The latch was worn, the corners faded. Inside, the old stock certificate still rested beside his handwritten note. I unfolded it carefully, reading the words for what felt like the 100th time. "Use it when they forget who you are." I smiled. "I did, Grandpa. I really did." But my voice cracked on the last word. Because somewhere deep down I still missed him, the only person who'd ever believed I was more than the quiet one. I placed the note back in the box and closed it gently, as if sealing a chapter. The flight attendant returned. "Would you like anything else, Miss Miller?" I shook my head. "No, thank you." She hesitated, then said softly, "I just wanted to say, I saw the video. The way you handled it, it was inspiring. My sister and I still talk about it." I looked up at her, surprised. "You saw that?" She nodded. "I work ground crew sometimes. People still talk about how calm you were. It made me rethink how I treat people. So, thank you." Her sincerity disarmed me. "You don't owe me thanks," I said. "Just pay it forward." She smiled and left. I stared out at the endless blue sky and thought, maybe that was the real victory, not the headlines, not the apologies, not the balance sheets. It was this, a stranger choosing kindness because she'd seen what cruelty looked like. Hours passed in silence. The rhythm of flight had always comforted me, the steady hum, the soft sway, the illusion of control. But this time it felt different. I wasn't escaping anymore. I was returning. The captain's voice came over the intercom. We'll begin our descent into Atlanta shortly. Current weather, clear skies, 70 degrees. I looked down. The city unfolded beneath the clouds, small neighborhoods, winding highways, 1,000 tiny lives, moving forward unaware of mine. As we descended, the light shifted. The clouds turned rose gold, the wings catching fire from the setting sun. I pressed my palm to the window, feeling the vibration through the glass. For the first time I realized I wasn't thinking about what came next. I wasn't planning or defending or strategizing. I was simply being. When the wheels touched down, the sound was gentle, not jarring. The engines slowed, the world returning to motion around me. The attendant opened the cabin door and smiled. "Welcome home, Miss Miller." Home. It was strange hearing that word again. The city didn't feel like home anymore, but maybe home wasn't a place. Maybe it was a moment, one where you could breathe without fear, stand without apology, and remember your own worth. As I stepped off the plane, the warm air hit my face, and I closed my eyes. Somewhere nearby, another flight was taking off, engines roaring against the wind. The sound didn't feel intimidating anymore. It felt like possibility. I walked across the tarmac toward the waiting car. My steps were steady, my heart unburdened. The driver opened the door, but I paused before getting in, looking back at the jet gleaming in the afternoon light. It was mine technically, but I didn't feel like an owner. I felt like a passenger who'd finally learned to trust the journey. As I slid into the seat, my phone buzzed, once a message from an unknown number. "You handled it with grace. Maybe one day we can talk." No name, but I knew who it was. Lauren. I typed one word back, someday. The car pulled away and I leaned my head against the window. The city rolled by, buildings, people, lights. Everything the same, yet everything changed. For the first time in a long while, I felt light enough to rise. Not as the quiet one, not as the forgotten one. Just grace. And that was finally enough. The morning sun hit different that day. It wasn't harsh or blinding, just warm, like the kind that sits quietly on your skin and reminds you that life still moves forward. I stood in a patch of soft dirt, hands covered in soil, planting the first row of lavender. Around me, the sound of shovels, laughter, and birdsong filled the air. It was the opening day of the Wings of Respect Foundation Community Garden, and for once the noise didn't overwhelm me. It comforted me. The garden stretched across a small corner lot next to the public library, the same library where I used to hide after school when home felt too heavy. Now it was full of color rose bushes, young trees, benches, waiting to hold quiet conversations. A new sign stood by the entrance, painted white, with blue lettering, "Wings of Respect, a place to grow." I straightened up, brushing dirt off my gloves. Volunteers were scattered everywhere, college students, retirees, mothers with their children. One woman waved at me from across the garden. "Miss Miller, where should we plant the daisies?" "By the walkway," I said, smiling. "They'll get more light there." She nodded, and I watched her return to her daughter, both of them laughing as they dug together. A familiar voice came from behind me. "Not bad for your first garden." I turned to see Elliot standing near the fence, a cup of coffee in hand. His silver hair gleamed under the Sunday you came, I said. "Of course," he replied. "Wouldn't miss it. You've built something real here, Grace." I looked around at the people, at the life sprouting from the soil. "It's small, but it feels right." He nodded. "You turned pain into purpose. That's more than most people manage." "Maybe," I said softly. "But it's not about me anymore." He smiled. "That's how I know it's working." A gentle breeze passed between us, carrying the scent of fresh soil and lavender. I watched a little girl run across the path holding a watering can almost bigger than her. Her laughter sounded like something pure, something untouched by the kind of cruelty I'd lived through. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was fighting the world. I was building something with it. Elliot stayed for a while, talking with some of the volunteers. When he finally left, he squeezed my shoulder and said, "Your grandfather would have loved this." I smiled. "He's the reason it exists." By noon, the sun was high and bright. I was arranging seedlings when I heard someone call my name softly. "Grace," I turned. Lauren stood at the edge of the garden, hands clasped in front of her, looking hesitant. She wasn't wearing her usual armor of perfection, no makeup, no designer clothes. Just jeans, a plain shirt, and tired eyes. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then I said, "You found it." She gave a nervous laugh. "Your address wasn't exactly hard to find. The local news did a whole segment on your redemption garden." I chuckled. "I didn't name it that." "I know," she said quietly. "You never did things for show." I gestured to the patch of empty soil beside me. "Want to help?" She blinked. "You want me to plant something?" "Why not?" I said. "It's easier than apologizing." Her mouth fell open, then closed again. After a moment, she crouched beside me. I handed her a pair of gloves and a trowel. We worked in silence for a while, side by side, digging small holes and setting tiny shoots into the ground. It felt strange, but not uncomfortable. The earth has a way of softening edges between people. Finally, Lauren spoke. "I don't know where to start." "Then don't," I said. "Just plant." She nodded, pressing a root into the dirt. "You know," she said after a while, "when I saw that video of you at the airport, I wasn't angry. Not at first. I was ashamed." I looked at her. "You should have been." She winced but didn't argue. "I've had a lot of time to think. I lost everything, my job, my friends, even my confidence, and I deserve that. But watching you build this, it made me realize something." "What?" "That maybe it's not too late to become someone better." I pressed my hand into the soil, feeling its cool weight. "It's never too late," I said. "But it's never easy either." Lauren looked around the garden. "Can I come back? Help out sometimes?" "Of course," I said. "We need more hands." She gave me a small, genuine smile, the first I'd seen from her in years. "Thank you." We went back to planting. The silence between us this time was peaceful. By afternoon, the garden was alive with color. Rows of lavender, sunflowers, marigolds, and small fruit trees swayed in the light breeze. Volunteers started leaving one by one, waving goodbye and promising to return. When the last car pulled away, I sat on one of the new benches, wiping sweat from my forehead. The air was thick with the scent of earth and possibility. A soft voice spoke beside me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" It was Mrs. Gable, the older woman who lived 2 streets over. She carried a small pot of flowers, her cane tapping gently against the gravel. "Mrs. Gable," I said, smiling. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it," she said, sitting down beside me. "This neighborhood needed a little kindness." I nodded. "We all do." She placed the flower pot on the ground between us. "These are lavender, too. My husband used to grow them, said they keep away bad spirits." "Maybe they do," I said softly. She smiled. "I've been following your story, Grace. You've had quite a journey." I looked at the rows of flowers stretching out in front of us. "It doesn't feel like a journey anymore, more like a landing." She patted my hand. "Then you landed right where you were meant to." The sun began to dip behind the trees, turning the sky into streaks of gold and pink. I stood and walked to the center of the garden where a small wooden sign waited. With careful strokes, I painted the words I'd written the night before. "In memory of Henry Miller, who taught me that wings are built, not given." The paint glistened in the last light of day. Lauren came over, wiping her hands on her jeans. "That's beautiful," she said. "He believed in growing things," I said, "even when no one else did." She looked at the sign, then at me. "You're a lot like him." For the first time, I didn't push the compliment away. "Maybe I am." Mrs. Gable stood slowly and smiled at both of us. "I'll leave you girls to finish. Save me a spot when it's done." "We will," I said. When she left, Lauren and I stood there for a while, the quiet wrapping around us like a soft blanket. Finally, she asked, "What are we planting next, Hope?" I said. She laughed lightly. Does that grow well in this soil? I looked around at the rows of green sprouting against the fading sky. It does if you tend it. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the garden glowed under the string lights we'd hung earlier. The plants swayed, gently catching the golden light. It looked like something alive, something breathing, a piece of peace I didn't know I'd been searching for. I knelt down one last time, pressing a small seed into the soil. "Every seed deserves a sky," I whispered. And as the stars began to appear above us, I realized that mine was finally wide open. The camera light blinked once, then turned solid red. I adjusted it slightly, making sure the frame caught the edge of the window behind me where the evening light spilled in. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the city outside. My laptop sat open beside me, a mug of tea steaming next to it, and a small vase of lavender from the garden stood in the corner of the shot. I took a deep breath and smiled at the lens. "My name is Grace Miller," I said softly. "And a while ago my sister called me a beggar at an airport counter." I paused, letting the silence sit. It's strange, isn't it, how a single moment can change everything. I looked down for a second, then back up. People ask me why I didn't shout that day, why I didn't fight back. The truth is, I didn't need to. I'd spent my whole life shouting in ways no one ever heard. Silence was the only language left that spoke for me. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the back of my mind. "Use it when they forget who you are." I smiled faintly. I think they remembered. The chat window beside the recording screen blinked with new comments from the live audience, small hearts floating up the side. But I didn't read them yet. I wanted to finish this like a letter, not a performance. I grew up thinking that love was something you earned, that if you worked hard enough, smiled often enough, stayed small enough, people would give you kindness. But I learned that's not how it works. Some people don't recognize your worth until it costs them something to ignore it. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. When my family turned on me, it hurt. Not because I lost them, but because I realized they'd never truly been there to begin with. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. A gust of wind rattled the window slightly. I turned my head and smiled. Funny how quiet it is now. Years ago, quiet used to scare me. It felt like rejection. Now it feels like peace. I reached off screen and picked up the old wooden box, the same one that had started everything. This box belonged to my grandfather, Henry Miller. Inside it was a piece of paper, 10,000 shares of a company everyone thought was worthless. Turns out it wasn't. I ran my hand along the smooth edge. He didn't give it to me because he thought it would make me rich. He gave it to me because he knew I'd need a reminder someday that worth isn't given. It's built. I set it gently beside me. And when I used that gift, it wasn't to get even. It was to find balance. A notification pinged on the corner of the screen. I saw names I recognized, people who'd been following my story since the airport video went viral. Some sent heart emojis. Others wrote things like, "You inspired me to quit my toxic job," or "Thank you for reminding me I'm enough." I read one line out loud. One person wrote, "Revenge looks different when you do it with dignity." I smiled. I think that's true. Revenge doesn't always have to destroy. Sometimes it rebuilds. I stood and walked over to the window camera, still rolling. Outside, the city shimmered under the setting Sunday. I used to think power was about control, who gets the final word, who wins the argument, who walks away first. But power, real power, is choosing to stay kind in a world that taught you cruelty. I turned back to the camera. When I look at where I am now, I don't see success. I see survival turned into purpose. The foundation, the garden, the people I've met, none of that came from anger. It came from remembering that dignity can grow even in poisoned soil. There was a small pause. The lavender swayed slightly in the draft. "So if you're watching this," I said, softly, "and you've ever been humiliated, dismissed, or made to feel small, please listen to me. You are not the sum of their opinions. You don't need permission to exist. You don't need their approval to rise. I felt the words tighten in my throat but didn't stop. They called me quiet. They called me weak. They called me forgettable. And maybe I was all of those things once. But quiet doesn't mean powerless. Weak doesn't mean wrong. And forgettable, I smiled. That just means they weren't paying attention. The live chat filled with new comments, messages of love stories, of pain stories of recovery. I took a deep breath, grounding myself in their noise. You know what the best part is, I said. After everything, after the lawsuits, the apologies, the headlines, I don't hate them. My family. I don't. Hate's just another kind of chain, and I'm done carrying weight that isn't mine. I picked up my tea, the steam curling upward like smoke from something finally burned out. Forgiveness doesn't mean I let them back into my life. It means I let myself out of the fire. Someone in the chat wrote, "How did you find peace?" I thought for a moment, then answered aloud. By planting it. One seed at a time. In a garden, in a conversation, in every decision to be kind when bitterness would have been easier. A knock on the door startled me. I turned off the microphone and opened it slightly. Lauren stood there holding a small potted plant, tiny green shoots just beginning to sprout. She gave a shy smile. "I thought you might need another one for the window." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I stepped aside. "Come in." She set the pot on the windowsill next to the lavender. "It's called peace lily," she said. "Someone told me they're hard to kill." I smiled. "Good. Then it'll survive us." For a while, we stood in silence watching the city lights blink on. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she looked back. "You really forgave me," I nodded. "I had to. Otherwise, I'd still be stuck in that airport." Her eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "Thank you." Then she was gone. I sat back in front of the camera, pressing record again. "Before I go," I said, "I want to ask you something." I leaned closer, my tone gentle but firm. Have you ever had to walk away from someone or something just to save yourself? If you have, I hope you know, that doesn't make you selfish. It makes you strong. It makes you whole. I smiled, feeling the weight lift as the words left me. Tell me your story in the comments. I'll be reading them. Maybe together we can remind the world what quiet strength really looks like. I reached forward and turned off the camera. The red light faded to black. Outside, the first stars appeared above the city. I stood by the window, the peace lily glowing softly in the reflection of the streetlights. The garden lights flickered on in the distance, tiny constellations of their own. They called it revenge, I whispered. But it was never about that. The air felt lighter, alive. I pressed my palm to the glass and closed my eyes. It was about remembering who I am. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.